ongoing coverage of Russia's war against Ukraine. My name is Matt Boyce. I'm an adjunct fellow here at Hudson. It's my distinct honor and pleasure and privilege to welcome two distinguished guests to Hudson, former Foreign Minister of Ukraine, Pavlo Klimkin, and Reka Smerkini from the International Republican Institute. Pavlo, you have been the Foreign Minister of Ukraine during 5 action-packed years, 2014 to 2019. You were the Ambassador of Ukraine to Germany. You were the Deputy Foreign Minister who, among other things, prepared the association agreement with the EU. And that, of course, and we're known as the sort of Ukraine's face of European integration. We of course know how that ended. The president at the time, Viktor Yanukovych, declined to sign that. And of course, that led ultimately to the Euromaidan and the Revolution of Dignity. Now you had a think tank in Kyiv, the Center for National Resilience and Development. So welcome back to Hudson. Reka, you are the Senior Advisor for Transatlantic Strategy at IRI, and formerly you were the Ambassador of Hungary to the United States. Welcome back. You're a great Atlanticist and a great friend, so welcome back to Hudson. And of course, we have our Luke Coffey, Senior Fellow at Hudson, needs no introduction, prolific writer on Ukraine and other issues. So anyway, we have a very interesting panel today. Just one housekeeping issue before we start. Pavlo will make some remarks of a number of 5-10 minutes at the beginning, and then we'll move to the conversation afterwards. So Pavlo, it's great to have you here. Welcome back to DC, and the floor is yours.
Matt, thanks a lot for the friendliest ways of teasing me up on your integration and faces, but I indeed spent kind of 20 years on the European Union and negotiated our EU-Ukraine association agreement. I believe there is an intrinsic link between our drive towards Europe and towards the European Union and Russian and Putin attempts to destroy Ukraine as such. Putin is not able, fundamentally not able to see Ukraine as Ukraine. For him, Ukraine is either Russia or anti-Russia, the way he called us in his famous article. Ukraine is artificial. There is no Ukrainian language, no statehood, no history, basically nothing. And it's a fundamental part of the Russian ideology, how he understands it. But even more so, and I remember it quite well, the whole Russian and Putin's drive on Ukraine started for me in 2003. I was humble Director General on EU affairs. And in 2003, Putin started 2 big exercises against us. One is to impose so-called common economic space on us. It's the idea to swallow Ukrainian economy and fully control it under the Russian rules. It's what Putin wanna impose now on Belarus and Lukashenko. And the second idea was so-called trilateral gas consortium, Russia, Ukraine, and Germany. And the real goal of Putin was to get 50% plus full control of our gas transit system, full control over transit to Europe, which was from the very beginning and actually from the Soviet time a fundamental leverage of dependence towards Europe. both exercises, and I was a member of our delegation in both of these exercises, failed. And we are quite proud of that. You remember the history. After that, Tuzla came. The idea to dig the Kiev Straits and Orange Revolution and Yanukovych. I'm saying all that to show the sense that it's not a kind of out of the blue reaction by Putin. 2 years ago, 1 year ago, 2014 or before that. For him, it's a sense of mission. To destroy Ukraine as such, to destroy Ukrainian identity. He clearly understands having Ukraine, and even more, having Ukraine as a European country would destroy his sense and Russian sense of what Russia should be. And there is deeply entrenched sense also in Russia among people, a sense of being offended because of the whole empire and Soviet Union project was broken. It's how it's all started. We can discuss military stuff and all the issues a bit later, but I wanna map out three, I believe, very important points about where we want to hit at the end of the day. And it's about the future, it's about the end game, although I hate this, a bit bureaucratic definition. But it's about the future sense of security for Ukraine. Of course, we are confident to make decisive gains on the battleground, but we need in any kind of future negotiations, and I believe negotiations with Russia are only possible from the clear position of strength. And it's not just about how you understand Russia. It's also about Putin's mentality and Russian mentality. You can effectively negotiate with Russia only from the position of strength. And such position of strength could be and will be created because of military advances. Such a position of strength could be and should be created because of economic pressure and economic isolation of Russia. And here we need strategic clarity, because normally sanctions is about changing someone's behavior. Sanctions and restrictions now applied to Russia are going wider in the sense of strategically weakening Russia. We all understand that by more sanctions, we are unfortunately unable to change Putin's behavior because it's a sense of mission and ideology. We of course need to strategically weaken Russia, but if you see it from Kiev, not from DC or Paris, it's about lives, it's about time, and we are running against the clock. So we need to cut off real possibilities for Russia to wage this war in the same way how it's been waged now, and to undercut Putin's and his regime ability. And here we need the sense of Western solidarity, because now discussions about more export restrictions have been getting so difficult with the European Union, but also with others. And we need this sense of leadership again from the US, what the US showed in the run-up to the all-out invasion and during this war. So, of course, it's about military assistance. Of course, it's about exchange of information. Of course, it's about logistics. But it's definitely also about further economic isolation of Russia. And my third point, we need sustainable security in Europe as a result of this war. Simply to freeze it up and say, look, let's wait a bit, let's have a break, we're gonna see what could happen afterwards, let's try to manage it. It's crazy dangerous. We can be as creative as possible and generate different ideas about security. I spent decades on security policy, but very roughly, I could structure different options in three main scenarios on security. One would I like to call a sort of porcupine scenario. It's about giving Ukraine the way to deter Russia, to give us as much weapons as possible, as sophisticated as possible, to ensure logistics, to ensure supply, to ensure basically everything, and of course to support us financially and technologically, but saying, look guys, after that it's about you to care about your security. We are unable, or better to say unwilling, to go into commitments or real security guarantees. It's a very traumatic experience for the Ukrainians to talk about 1994 Stat 1 Treaty and Budapest Memorandum. Stat 1 Treaty was my first responsibility as I joined the Foreign Ministry on strategic arms control and disarmament. ABM Treaty and Stat 1 Treaty were my first assignments. And here we made a fundamental mistake, of course, in how we handle it, because we should have asked for NATO membership, for the association agreement, but it's difficult to judge people backwards, because how you expect the guy in charge of ideology in the Ukrainian Communist Party to come up and say, now it's about EU and NATO and it's about our future security. But anyway, I believe that a kind of Ukrainian deterrence is a fundamentally not sustainable option. It's unfair towards Ukraine and the Ukrainians. It would not work. It would create another spiral of uncertainty. Let's talk about Ukrainian recovery. Who would invest internally or externally in Ukraine if you have all the risks and it's just about Ukrainian deterrence? We all understand that if we are in a conventional reality, the Russians have more potential in the sense of their security and defense sector and the sheer scope of Russia. So for me, this option is fundamentally wrong. The second option, let's call it kind of Ukrainian fortress of guarantees, is about a network of bilateral guarantees or one comprehensive set of guarantees, probably by NATO, but we can play it in a different way, legally or from the political point of view. It actually quite problematic, and I'll tell you why. I've been asked many times by my friends here in DC or in Europe, saying, look, Paul, there could be sort of extended deterrence. A couple of days ago, the Korean president has been there talking about extended deterrence. I'm not drawing any parallels, don't get me wrong, between Korea and Ukraine or between Japan and Ukraine. And we could actually imagine a network of security guarantees. But for me, it could be just a sort of transitional solution towards the NATO membership. And the key problem, the key challenge with such guarantees is whether you guarantee these guarantees, whether you trust these guarantees. I remember discussions within the NATO about whether the Article 5 is bulletproof. I remember Estonians or Poles asking whether it's bulletproof and how can we trust that. Maybe it's wrong in the sense of solidarity and trust, but at the backdrop of Russia, how we have it, it unfortunately makes sense. And the third option, it's about NATO. And with all kind of difficult discussions here about not willing to get into direct conflict with Russia, with all kind of fears and lack of will to raise the stakes and the kind of difficult discussions where how Russia would react. My sense, if you like, a sort of educated guess here, is that Putin would not be able to react in a kind of forceful way. But for the West, it would be the moment of truth. It would be a way to avoid a key security vacuum. And the reason why we have war against Russia is actually, and was security vacuum, and is still security vacuum around Ukraine. And of course, it's about us. And as a Ukrainian, I care about Ukraine. But talk about Moldova. What kind of security model can you take for Moldova? We can basically go on with a number of examples, and any sort of endgame. It's actually my point. Is not possible without getting ambitious on security for Ukraine. And we need this prospect. We need a clear idea how the security of Ukraine should be guaranteed in the future. Without that, it all gonna come back. Just imagine, we again have kind of assurances. Discussion about asymmetric deterrence will definitely come back, whether it's nuclear or something else. Putin again will use it as a sort of pretext, and it's gonna be a sort of vicious circle, a kind of spiral of uncertainty and destabilization. So to sort it out once and for all would be a really important point. And for the Western credibility, it's not just about us and Russia, it's also about China, it's about a lot of stuff. So anything we could discuss in the sense of how we could imagine what should happen in the future is for me about clear idea how security should be ensured around Ukraine and around the whole region. It's my point. And let me stop here because we could discuss some.
There's a lot.
I'm afraid I've been talking already for kind of quarter of an hour. It's time to shut up and and switch to good discussions with friends.
You've come a long way, so that's okay. That's okay. In fact, we want to take advantage of your presence here to hear your views. But picking up on something you just said at the very beginning, it's sort of a bit of a historical issue before we get into all the other more current events. You mentioned how this has been on Putin's agenda now for years and years and years. And I know you argued to this in 2017 in The Guardian, where you basically talked about Putin's obsession with restoring Soviet hegemony as the greatest threat to security and unity of Europe since 1945. And then in 2020, you predicted in Salon that Putin may go for the jugular if then candidate Biden were to win the 2020 election. Now, looking back, what do you think about this now? I mean, you probably would prefer to have been wrong.
Definitely.
But who among the experts, since we're at a think tank, who among the pundits, the academics, the the think tankers, the statesmen and women, who was right and who was not, and any sort of, what does this say about the state of expertise in this country or elsewhere about your country and about Russia? And then we'll go on to the more current issues that everyone's thinking about.
If I say almost everybody, it would be probably a real overstatement here. I recall quite well political consultations in Germany at the end of 2008, right after the Georgian War. And I said to the guys present in the room, it's highly likely, and I believe the probability is 50% or more, that the next goal for Putin should have been Ukraine. They told me, no, Pavlo, look, it's of course it's about gas, it's about oil, it's about all this interdependence, and Putin is not an idiot. It's basically, I remember these consultations quite well. It's literally so. And my point was, Putin is quite rational, but not rational in your sense. He has different set of goals, and he said he has different set of values. So I do prefer actually being wrong on my ideas and on my predictions. I was trying to convince people, and very vocally. The Germans were kind of bitter on me, drumming up about the Nord Stream 2. I was very vocal in German media, and once actually the former Chancellor Merkel said around the table when we were discussing actually Normandy format, completely different topics, that we have a couple of people in the room present, in every interview to German media talking about Nord Stream 2 and the security risks. And now you basically see the security risk, because for Putin it was about circumventing Ukraine with gas flows and to attack Ukraine after that right away. So my point, firstly, if the West substantially lost competence on Russia, a lot of people pretend to understand Russia, but are not able to feel what is going on internally. Secondly, even after 15 months of all-out invasion, there is still no analysis on mistakes made. With all kind of pushing the button, reload of relations with Russia for whatever reasons. And for me, it's not a kind of blaming exercise, kind of showing people. Understanding on what Russia is, and in the same way China, although I'm not drawing any parallel here, it's a different world, it's a different autocracy, is critical, and we can't go on with pretending understanding them, sitting there and saying 1, 2, 3. So fundamentally, we believe we were quite unfortunately right on Putin, on the nature of the regime, on Europe somehow nurturing Putin in the sense of economic model. And we have to say it in a very honest way. Again, not as a part of blaming game, but as our understanding how it's happened.
Right. This may seem like ancient history, of course, but it is actually also relevant for the present. Unfortunately.
Ancient history, definitely not for me.
No, I mean, it is very living history for you and for all your countrymen and women. Reka, switching to Central Europe for your perspective, Central European perspective, as a former ambassador to Hungary and the United States, for example, and focusing on that as you do right now at IRI, how are Central European countries holding up under the economic stress. I mean, is pressure in Central Europe growing for any kind of endgame that Pavlo was referring to? What can we expect in Central Europe in the next 6 months or so in terms of their approaches towards the war?
Thank you so much for doing this discussion and for inviting me. I think it is a very sensitive moment we are in now from a Central European perspective. We could see just recently the demonstrations of the agriculturers because of the, originally transit, but then of course the import of Ukrainian grain through Central Europe. And I think it is a sensitive moment because what we need to be focusing on is how to keep the support in a political and strategic sense for the support for Ukraine. And so, yes, we have to focus on that. And I think this has been raised by the Polish official political positions to how to solve this, and ultimately, relatively fast, the European reaction could kind of ease this pressure. But there is no doubt that this kind of an economic and political pressures can be directed at decreasing the support from behind the efforts for Ukraine. So I think what Central Europe has been experiencing is, without saying or really focusing on this, is the collapse of several big theories that Europe and Central Europe, part of Central Europe, but primarily Europe, based its relations to Russia on. One is, for instance, that mutual trade and expanding on trade relations will create a stability and a security. Another one was that exactly. Or cooperation in various sectors can lead over to strategic cooperation, which none of those happened. So I think we could see the collapse of two big theories that Europe based its relations to Russia on, and that had a direct repercussion for Central Europe as well. So this is why I think the strategic understanding of Central Europe, what we can see in the last year since Russia's attack on Ukraine, is more than just a reaction to a new geopolitical reality. It's a reaction of creating a new approach towards Russia. And I think that's why we're in a very important moment, because Ukraine will have to be very strongly part of this new strategy towards dealing with Russia.
Luke, you've been very vocal in making the case for a sustained U.S. commitment to Ukraine. But Kiev and other countries may be looking with some concern at the domestic debates in the United States and other countries providing support. How should Ukrainians understand the state of play here in this country? Should Kiev be concerned, even if the Biden administration stresses it will be with Ukraine for as long as it takes?
Thanks. It's great to be on this platform with Pavlo and Rika and to talk about these important issues. The problem with the administration's language saying that the U.S. will be with Ukraine for however long it takes is no one has defined the word it. Right? So is it victory? Is it equal victory? Does it equal some sort of negotiated settlement? And to be fair, the problem the White House has is that really only the Ukrainians can define it. And luckily they have for us. President Zelensky has been very clear that he sees the full restoration of Ukraine's territorial integrity based off the 1991 borders as their definition of victory. And we should be planning our aid and our support to Ukraine based off those lines. We should have our planning assumptions, assuming that Ukraine will attempt to restore its full territorial integrity, to include Crimea. The problem we have here in Washington is a lack of leadership from the very top explaining to the American people why the situation in Ukraine matters to them, and doing so in a way they understand. When President Biden does talk about this, he uses these vague terms that most Americans, most people don't understand, like, we have to defend the international rules-based order. Well, I've been in Washington for many years, and I've worked on international affairs for many years, and I'm not sure I know what he means when he says that. We've also been giving Ukraine just enough to survive and not enough to win when it comes to our military support. And we're now entering this continuous cycle of this buildup of U.S. support to Ukraine in anticipation of some expected counteroffensive. And then you have this low where we go back to the survival mode. And then presumably we'll start this up again sometime next year, where we'll start the training and the equipping again for the next counteroffensive in 2024. We have to change this mentality. Instead of seeing the war in Ukraine as a series of individual battles to be fought, we have to start seeing the war against Ukraine as a continuous campaign, where the U.S. is prepping and preparing Ukraine for one counteroffensive and then simultaneously laying the groundwork to help Ukraine survive the next winter and then prepare for the following year. Right now, we have this disconnected approach where we're not seeing it as one continuous campaign event. And so this is a concern for me as well. My final concern is that expectations are so high for this upcoming counteroffensive that there's already some people suggesting that future U.S. aid to Ukraine will be contingent on Ukraine's success or failure in this upcoming offensive. And this is the wrong way to look at the situation. Throughout the history of war, there's always been ups and downs. There's going to be defeats and victories on the battlefield. We cannot predicate or decide future U.S. military assistance to Ukraine based off a single event. And we have to look at the big strategic picture. So I think a little bit more leadership from the White House, explaining to the American public why Ukraine matters, explaining to Capitol Hill why it's in our interest to support Ukraine would go a long way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good. Pablo, turning to you again. So you've just arrived from Kyiv, and so I mean, sort of maybe we get a sense from you of like what's the mood on the ground there. I mean, the Ukrainian people have made it through a very harsh winter and made enormous sacrifices over the last 15 months or so. What's the mood on the ground there? I mean, in the capital and across the country. How would you describe the resiliency? Your center is called the Center for National Resilience. How would you describe the morale and resilience of Ukrainian society as the counteroffensive approaches?
It's an important part of resilience in the center, but it's about security or energy resilience, and in the sense of mood, it's amazing. I am simply so much proud of my fellow Ukrainians when you see people sitting in their apartments through all blackouts, partly without district heating, with people working on that after all these missiles, without communication. And there is a new sense of national pride and actually trust in ourselves. After all that, Ukrainians are fundamentally different mentally from the Russians. Many people started understanding that only 2014, and even more so from the moment of their all-out invasion. It's now understood in Europe that Ukraine is Europe and the Ukrainians are Europeans. But before that, it was a kind of mantra which has been voiced every time, but so what? But now Ukrainians, if you see any opinion poll, it's kind of 90% of Ukrainians who are unwilling to enter into any sort of compromise with Putin. It's 9 from 10 after more than 1 year of the war, after this winter, after what happened. And it's really a sort of new sense of identity, what we are about in Ukraine. It's about this simple feeling that we are able to fight and we are willing to fight. Because it's about Ukraine we want to live in. And we don't want to live in a kind of Russian-led Ukraine. It's over. It's so much clear for everyone. And of course, we could have done better. The point Luke has just mentioned. We did very well on the ground in September, in October, with liberating territories around Kharkiv and Hudson. And it's really about trying to control this war, like a kind of conflict. What you see as a part of simulating that. Why not to give Ukraine all the armored vehicles, but also tanks actually in full, to prepare ourselves logistically, to prepare ourselves militarily. And now it's a kind of almost heroic exercise to get everything to Ukraine what is needed to the set of oncoming counteroffensive. But if we'd done it in October, in November, in the sense of training, in the sense of structure, and we should not discuss all kind of military details here. And the fundamental point here, if you like to win against the Russians, and it's possible, it's really possible. It's a game changer. It's a mental change that you can win against the Russians. But in order to win, you have to start fighting. And fighting is linked to the risks. Fighting has its costs. Mm-hmm. And as Ukrainians, we are ready to bear this cost. But it's important that the West, our allies, at least are ready to also raise the stakes. Because without raising the stakes, you can win. It's either you dragging down the whole exercise. It's with clear understanding that Russia is not sustainable. That, of course, Russia has to be strategically weakened, but it's a different clock ticking in Ukraine. If you sit in Kiev and if you sit in DC, and I'm saying it with all kind of respect for my friends here, because what had been done in this war would not be possible without the US and without the US leadership. One clear lesson of this war: there is no collective West without the US leadership. Whether US actually does want it or does not. We would love to have shared leadership, with Europe as a special center, and not talking about all senses about European strategic autonomy. And I've been listening to all these ideas for kind of 10 plus years. But my point is, if you believe that we need to win, and of course we can discuss this definition of what actually victory is for us, for Ukrainians, for the West, and there are some discrepancies within the West. Let's be honest. But at least one point should be clear: we have to win. And we can't win just militarily. As I've said, it's also about economic isolation. It's about sanctions. It's about the victory should be comprehensive. There is no one way to win against such country as Russia. But now Russia is the same like the Russian regime. So fundamentally, this regime is dangerous for everyone, not just for Ukraine. Mm. It's about destabilizing any sort of security arrangement. It's about killing of security arrangements. Because what we had from Helsinki 1975, it's dead. Mm. So what is not that in the sense of security? Russia killed all kind of arms control treaties and everything. So fundamentally, we have to win. It's really my point. And here, you know, we need to embrace this mentality of winning.
Speaking of leadership, Reka, the Central Europeans have also shown quite very, very strong leadership in this. Not only the Poles and the Balts, but others as well. And so, I mean, some people even argue that as a result of that, the center of gravity in NATO, if not the EU, is moving to the east and to the north with the accession of Finland to NATO and hopefully soon Sweden. Western European countries, of course, disagree with that, presumably, and explicitly or otherwise. And so who's right? I mean, is the center of gravity moving away, shifting more towards the eastern flank of NATO? And I mean, how should Americans think about this? And does it have any any implications that it might have for the United States?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, I very much can see that. And it's very interesting because I think this is a process that started really before February 2022. But Russia's attack against Ukraine absolutely speeded up history in this sense in Central Europe, and I believe also in Ukraine in many ways as well. Because what we have seen is that new ideas, new suggestions, new thoughts, initiatives of what the North Atlantic Treaty Organization should do, how it should be, prepared to get ready for the next big challenges, have over the last, several years have not come from kind of the western part of the European continent. They have always been coming and originating from the Central European countries. And I think that has been a distinct feature before. It has absolutely been highlighted, heightened after February 2022. And I think, what is very clear is that it's not just, okay, geopolitics have, appeared big time in our thinking and in foreign policy thinking. But that can create several types of reactions. It could create, giving up and just saying, okay, we can't do anything, about our future. It can create, messing up. It's like not knowing, running around and creating strange, political messaging. Or it can create a very strong focus on priorities. And I think this is what has been dominant in Central Europe. It has created focus. It has created a very clear list of priorities, not just the, within a month after the attack, I think in March 2022, we could see the 10 points developed by the Polish Premier Morawiecki on how to deal with how to respond to the attack of Russia. But also, ever since, I think all the agenda inside the European Union discussions as well are being defined, or agenda points are being defined by proposals of Central European members of the EU as well. So both in NATO and in the EU, what we can see is that, okay, we may not agree with all the points, and some points may not be acceptable for several members, that's fine. But the agenda points, the proposals of what to talk about, how to go forward, are absolutely being generated by the Central Europeans. So I think this kind of geopolitics has created geostrategic thinking. And I think this in Central Europe, and I think this is why the relations with Ukraine are particularly important, because Ukraine has obviously seen this, very fundamental ties with Washington. But it will, and I think identifying NATO and security guarantees inside NATO and NATO membership, identifying EU membership will be a process, especially for the EU discussions. I think there will be a long period in which a lot of decisions are going to be made at a table where Ukraine is not sitting yet. So I think, to find that kind of a strategic partnership, both for the United States as well as for Ukraine in the Central European states in particular, I think is going to be the biggest possibility and the biggest strategic development of the next decade.
Yeah, Western Europeans need to listen more to Central Europeans. Most definitely. So, Luke, in July, NATO, there will be a major summit in Vilnius, and expectations are very high about what will come out of that regarding Ukraine. How would you define a successful summit in the context of Ukraine? And what can NATO do to keep Ukraine on the path towards eventual membership?
Yeah, like with the expected counteroffensive, expectations are also very high, but this time on the Ukrainian side,
Right.
for the outcomes of the summit in Vilnius. We've heard from the foreign minister, the defense minister, that they expect very clear messaging on Ukraine's future path to joining NATO. The high expectations are not unreasonable, considering everything that Ukraine has gone through in recent years. And my starting point on this issue is acknowledging that symbolism matters in international affairs. So there's some symbolic things that NATO can do that are important, that would help Ukraine along its path to NATO, and there are some practical things that can be done. On the symbolic front, NATO has to refresh the stale, tired language from 15 years ago, from the Bucharest summit, when both Ukraine and Georgia were first acknowledged that they will someday join the alliance. We have to use a new set of wording that injects new passion and enthusiasm into Ukraine's eventual membership into NATO. We should also make sure that the Ukraine-NATO Commission meets at the heads of state and government level. In the past, this meeting often takes place at the foreign ministerial level. I think it would send a strong signal if it was President Zelensky that was set there for this meeting. We should also start a conversation about scrapping the membership action plan. This is the tool that NATO has used in recent years to bring new countries into the alliance. This tool, the MAP as it's called, was an effective tool for the more straightforward cases in Central and Eastern Europe in the 90s and early 2000s. But the remaining candidate countries have very complex geopolitical situations that warrants a more tailored and bespoke approach. So I have suggested that it could be called a tailored action plan geared specifically at each country's needs and circumstances. And maybe Ukraine could be the first to get a tailored action plan to chart a realistic, reasonable path to NATO membership with very clear benchmarks that the Ukrainians would have to meet before an invitation would be given. On the practical side, I would love to see NATO create a new trust fund to support Ukraine. In 2014, at the Wales Summit, NATO created 6 trust funds focusing on different issues impacting Ukraine, whether it was military wounded or counter IED, counter mine operations, for example. Out of the 6, 3 remain because they're more relevant to the fight that's going on today. I propose adding a 4th one called Train Today for Tomorrow Trust Fund, where NATO would pull together resources and funding to train Ukrainian soldiers on advanced military equipment that perhaps there are no plans to give Ukraine, but someday we might decide to give to Ukraine. So when we finally decide to give 4th generation fighter jets like the F-16 to Ukraine, they'll already have some pilots that are trained on it. They'll already have some ground crew who know how to operate and perform the maintenance on it. I think this would be a very useful way for NATO to help the Ukrainians on the long term. And then another idea I've been proposing, and it's not without controversy, is that NATO should ask Ukraine if it wants to participate in the NATO response force again. Now, I'll state that I understand in this war of national survival, every soldier that Ukraine has needs to be on the front lines defending the homeland and to liberate the territory. But at any given time, there are thousands of Ukrainian soldiers that are outside of Ukraine across Europe doing training. So the symbolism here, I think, would be important. So why not earmark some of these Ukrainian forces that are already out of Ukraine training elsewhere in Europe to get certified to form a part of the NATO response force? And that would really show that there is this connection between NATO and Ukraine. There's a precedent for this. Ukraine has already contributed in the past to NATO response force. And I think that would be a very helpful and symbolic way to show the ongoing NATO-Ukraine relationship. And then finally, I've been proposing the establishment of a NATO-certified Center of Excellence for Modern Warfare. For the past 2 decades, NATO has been focused on these low-intensity conflicts, counterinsurgency operations, and we have, on NATO's doorstep, we have Ukraine that's been fighting this very modern state-on-state war with Russia, and there are a lot of lessons to be learned. And that not only would help, establishing such a center would not only help NATO learn the hard-earned lessons that Ukraine has undergone since last February, but it would also be another way that we could be flying the Ukrainian flag next to the NATO flag. And I think this is something we should explore. So there are ways we can have a successful summit.
Yeah.
Let's just hope that there's the political will to do so.
Pavlo, everyone's talking about the counteroffensive now. Is this counteroffensive a preview to the endgame that we've sort of touched upon here? We've sort of talked about what the endgame is, but I'm not sure everybody really is on the same page with regard to the endgame. But what should we think about the counteroffensive? Because this is everyone's talking about it.
If we say sort of discussion simply has to come after military developments, we create a sort of trap for ourselves, because we have clear goal, as I've said, to win against this regime. There is no other way. Of course, it's about territory. Of course, it's about Ukrainians who live on the occupied territories. It's about liberating part of Ukraine. It's about liberating our soul in the way, because it's about people, and people our soul. But saying that after exactly this action or another set of actions, we have to start talking with a deliberate goal to reach a sort of settlement with the Russians. This is fundamentally wrong. It's not just counterproductive, it's wrong. So we need to find a way to understand what should be done militarily. We need to find a way how to raise the stakes on economic pressure, because if you have military offensive not linked by an economic, let's call it economic offensive, it would weaken the whole exercise. And of course, like Luke has just said, we need a powerful message by the West. We need a powerful message by NATO. And not in the sense that somewhere in the future Ukraine will become a member of NATO. It's basically a repetition of what happened in Bucharest. It's like the same narrative that we are going to help Ukraine, for what is needed. So fundamentally, we need a clear goal here, and our goal is to win against Russia. Whether we need this military action or other military actions, my point, we need to do everything to make Ukraine able to have this win together with the West. It's what's really needed, without imposing on us any sort of restrictions or benchmarks or any sort of conditions. The fundamental problem and the fundamental mistake of the West, for me, is setting up different red lines. Not delivering armored vehicles. I remember these discussions with the Germans. And after that, no, these armored vehicles, no. After that, okay, tanks, Leopards, no way, because it's about reminiscence towards the Second World War. And after that, again, the decision is there. And Russian mentality and Putin's personal mentality is about to explore these weaknesses. In creating a sort of maze out of the red lines fundamentally weakens your position against Russia, and but in a very different way against China. It's what I believe the West really has to learn from this war. So no red lines, but the goal and the way how to achieve it.
So we're running out of time now. So maybe just quickly for Reka and for Luke. Reka, so some of the Central European capitals right now are extremely all in on this. Others less so. And they argue inter alia that without security guarantees and strong institutional linkages with Europe, it's only a matter of time before Russia invades, Ukraine again, or another, Moldova or whatever, destabilizes, Georgia. And so, any kind of final thoughts on that issue before we wrap up?
Yeah, absolutely. I believe it's a very important question to understand for all of Central Europe, from all of Central Europe's historic experiences and most recent current economic and political ties in the larger region. What is very clear is that this new reality that is being shaped now with the not just the emergence of a new threat very clearly, old style at NATO's eastern flank, but also by gaining a very active and very strong new partner in Ukraine for Central Eastern Europe and for Europe in general. I believe this is the moment to grab that possibility to become, shapers and makers of history, and absolutely to tie those relations into a future structure of stability and cooperation.
Yeah, and Luke, similarly, that argument also is being conducted in the United States, where people. But you've argued, I think, sort of either you support Ukraine now or be prepared to spend more later. Do you think a Russian defeat would help lessen the cost to NATO member states in the long run? And how should Congress and the administration keep this in mind going forward?
Well, we're dealing with a 21st century Russia with 19th century ambitions. And Russia might be decisively beaten in Ukraine, but history tells us that they will be back. This idea that there'll be some sort of peace dividend like we thought would exist in the 1990s that never materialized, in fact, this line of thinking is very naive. For the foreseeable future, the U.S. should maintain a very robust military presence in Europe. We should continue working with our allies and partners to improve their military capabilities. The U.S. has a lot of economic and security interests on the European continent, and we should take all of these things into account. And for the foreseeable future, I would say almost indefinitely, Russia will always prioritize its foreign policy and geopolitics geared towards Central and Eastern Europe, because Vladimir Putin and those around him know that without control or influence over countries like Ukraine or Belarus, Russia is merely an Asian power and it's not a European power. And Moscow wants to be a European player, wants to be a European power. So I think we just have to assume that for the foreseeable future, Russia will be back even if beaten, and we have to maintain a robust military presence there.
Yeah. That was one of the things that my former professor at Columbia, Zbigniew Brzezinski, used to say: without Ukraine, Russia is not a superpower. So we've run out of time, unfortunately. There's a lot more we could have talked about. So perhaps now we'll just close now. Thank you, Pavlo. Thank you, Reka. And thank you, Luke, for this interesting discussion. And thank you all for joining us today. We look forward to welcoming you back to another Hudson event on this issue and others. So farewell. Thank you.
Building your online business? Go to Wix.com and set up your store on a single integrated platform.